Well, welcome to Heritage Hour. My name is Dana Thorne, and I'm the curator supervisor at Lambton Heritage Museum. I'll be serving double duty tonight as both the moderator and a presenter as well. I'm joined by some of my colleagues from cultural institutions across Lambton County to share a special patriotic edition of Heritage Hour. I'll address a few housekeeping items before we begin our presentations. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can use the Q&A to submit them. We'll take time at the end of the night to answer any questions. I'll be recording tonight's presentation, so if you want to watch it again or share it with family and friends, it will be online. We'll send an e-blast out with the link to the recording after the presentation tonight. You can also see all our previous Heritage Hours at heritagelambton.ca. So I hope everybody's ready tonight to go elbows up. We're going to be examining items and stories in our museum collections that reflect our Canadian identity. This theme came as a reflection on our current political and social climate and the wave of Canadian pride that has swept across the nation. In my lifetime, I've never seen this type of push to buy Canadian products, celebrate our Canadian culture, and assert ourselves as an independent nation. By looking more carefully at our local artifact collections and our local stories, we hope you can learn more about what it means to be Canadian and how that's reflected in our museums. Given the headlines that we're seeing daily and the pressures being felt by Canadians right now, it's more important than ever that we remember our history. Let's take some time tonight to reflect on the fact that we've been our own country and we've been building a unique identity for over 150 years. It's reassuring to know that there's continuity in these national symbols that Canadians respect and appreciate from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast. Our first presenter tonight is Fiona Doherty, the museum coordinator at Moore Museum, where she's worked since 2018. Fiona was born and raised in Point Edward and attended Western University studying anthropology and geography. She completed a museum studies program at Algonquin College and did her internship at the National Museum of Ireland. Thanks for being here, Fiona. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Great. I will share my screen there. Oop. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Thank you, Dana, for the introduction and having the museum join. My name is Fiona Doherty. I'm the curator of Moore Museum. And while doing research for this topic, I came across a book that we have in our collection called The Canadian Look by Ken Foley. If that name sounds familiar, it is because he was a well-known figure in Canadian broadcast media. A Vancouver native, his formal education ended with secondary school in Vancouver, but he was a constant reader, knowledgeable about everything from gold mining and horse racing to Canadian art. Editor-in-chief of Maclean's magazine in the early 1960s, he was mentored by the legendary Ralph Allen, another well-known Canadian journalist. Producer on the team that created CBC Television's This Hour Has 7 Days, a satire series which became a must-see show on Canadian TV on Sunday nights. And he actually just passed away a few years ago, 2002, at the age of 93. In the book, he talks about peculiar views and objects that identify Canada to us and stand for Canada in the eyes of outlanders everywhere. I thought this perspective was quite unique. He talks about things we think about as typical Canadian that we would recognize, like animals and clothes, but also some other topics like Canadian shapes and skylines that I found really interesting. It's definitely a good read if you have the chance. So I'll share a few of those ideas with you. The first is a cartoon figure called Johnny, or sometimes Jack Canuck. This book was my first introduction to him. So for those unfamiliar with him, he stood for Canada in the same way that Uncle Sam stood for the US or John Bull for England. He was created as a political cartoon in the mid 1800s, sometimes portrayed as a younger cousin of the United States' Uncle Sam and Britain's John Bull, and often depicted as resisting the bullying of the two. In his book, Ken describes this particular cartoon saying, in 1869, fresh from the Fenian troubles and the American opportunist politics that followed the Civil War, Johnny answers trade overtures from the US by booting an ugly Uncle Sam back across the border. However, much like today, the relationship between countries had its ups and downs. Just a few short years later, this cartoon appeared, which Ken described saying, by 1903, anxious for settlers to fill the West, he was the best friend Uncle Sam ever had. The name popped up in other areas as well, most notably in songs. Good Luck to the Boys of the Allies in 1915 was perhaps the most successful of Canada's early war songs, written by Morris Manley, whose lyrics paid tribute to all Allied soldiers but had a special praise for Johnny Canuck. The name also appears in this postcard that passed through Sarnia in what I believe is 1903. We can see the lyrics of the song When Johnny Canuck Comes Home, referring to Canadian soldiers who fought alongside England in the Boer War, the conflict fought between the British Empire and Dutch settlers in South Africa from 1899 to 1902. Johnny Canuck's popularity grew from the first mentions of him in the 1870s until World War I. He became a stock character in the long line of satirical magazines that came and went during those years, but eventually faded from popularity until he was reintroduced in the 1940s as a comic book hero. Sometimes called the first Canadian national hero, Canada's Captain America, if you will. Back in 1942, a young man named Leo Bayshell created this version of Johnny Canuck. Johnny's character was a kind of jack of all trades, a flying ace, a fighter, a secret agent, an officer in the Canadian military. Most of the time, Johnny was saving damsel in distress types and fought the Axis on almost every war front. When Johnny debuted in 1942 confronting Hitler, it helped propel Dime Comics, where he appeared, to become the best-selling comic in all the Bell's Features comic line. Throughout his comics, he traveled to Yugoslavia, Russia, Germany, Libya, Tibet, and China. It wasn't until the final issue that Johnny's story took place in Canada, and that was just off the coast of Halifax. Canada had its share of American comics before the 1940s, but in December of 1940, the Canadian government imposed the War Exchange Conservation Act, banning American-made luxury items, which included comics. It restricted the importing of goods from the US that were deemed non-essential to combat the trade deficit, and American comics were a casualty of this act. This created a comic book market for Canadian publishers, and for a short time, Johnny Canuck was Canada's favorite comic book hero. World War II era comic books published in Canada, called the Golden Age of Canadian Comics, also included Nelvana of the Northern Lights and Brock Windsor. When the war ended and the ban was lifted in 1946, what is now known as Canada's Golden Age in comics ended. Another Canadian look that Ken Foley talks about in his book that might be one more obvious is clothing. If you ask the average person what a Canadian look is now, you might get the stereotypical responses of the Canadian tuxedo or a classic red-green show plaid. But Canada has a history of distinct clothing tied closely to our cultural industries and activities. Specifically, our taste in hats has been unlike others. Moore Museum has an extensive hat collection, and if this topic interests you, we have a new millinery exhibit curated by Carrie Boone. It's on display at the museum now. The history of fur hats in Canada is deeply intertwined with the fur trade, particularly the iconic beaver felt hat, a fashion statement that had a rippling impact in Canadian industry, society, and culture. European fur traders prized beaver pelts above all other North American furs. French and English fur traders competed for access to this internationally sought-after commodity. And fashion fueled the competition. European hatters coveted beaver pelts for their soft underfur, which could be transformed into a malleable and water-resistant felt, suitable for gentlemen's hats, such as this one. The fur trade was, of course, initially dominated by Indigenous peoples and changed with the arrival of these European traders. There was a turning point in 1670 when England's King Charles II granted a royal charter to a fur trading venture called the Hudson's Bay Company. This allowed the company to establish fur trading posts over a vast area on the southern shore of the Hudson Bay. In return, the company paid the king an annual rent in hides from beaver and elk, two of the animals that are featured on the company's coat of arms. This also led to the establishment of other major companies like the Northwest Company. The broad-brimmed beaver hat became a fashion staple in Europe, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. Used winter coats worn by Native Americans were a prized commodity for hat making because their wear actually helped prepare the skins by separating out the coarser hair from the pelts. To make the felt, the underhairs were shaped from the beaver pelt and mixed with a hatter's bow. The matted fabric was pummeled and boiled repeatedly, resulting in a shrunken, thickened felt. filled over a hat form block. The felt was pressed and steamed into shape, and then finally the hat maker would brush the outside of the surface to a sheen. They were made in various styles that indicated civil or military status. And then slowly, as fashion trends shifted and more affordable materials became available, the beaver hat gradually lost its popularity. The rise of silk hats in the 1800s further contributed to the decline of the beaver hat industry. I'll talk briefly just about hat boxes because I think they're just as neat as the hats themselves. We have a few in our collection. This gray and pink one from the Eaton department store, the Canadian chain that was once the largest in the country. Founded in 1869 in Toronto by Timothy Eaton, it grew to become a retail and social institution in Canada. It went bankrupt in 1999, but the name still lives on in the iconic Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto. This stylish black and gold hat is from Dorothy Baden in Millinery and Accessories in Sarnia. I wasn't able to find too much information about Dorothy Baden or the millinery business that was named for her. However, some examples of the work from this shop are currently held at the Seneca Fashion Resource Collection and indicate that the business was open through the 1960s. The Seneca Fashion Resource Center is a collaboration between the school and the libraries, where they collect Canadian clothing items and make 3D scans available online for anyone just interested in looking at them or anyone studying fashion. So it's neat to know that some of our local businesses are being preserved in that way. The last one is a Stetson hat box. While Stetson is an American brand, it still has Canadian connections. The John B. Stetson Company was founded in Philadelphia in 1865 and has become symbolic of the pioneering West. It would eventually become the world's largest hat maker for a time. In the Second Boer War, the flat brim Stetson became the standard issue of the 2nd Canadian contingent, becoming recognized throughout the British Empire as a symbol of Canada. And that is the photo you see on the left there. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police red serge dress uniform also includes a Stetson with a flat brim. The Stetson was first used unofficially by the Northwest Mounted Police in place of a traditional white pith helmet, not practical for the Canadian West. And the Ontario Provincial Police also wore the Stetson in a gray woven fabric as part of their uniform in the early 1900s, and then again from 1997 to 2009. And that's the photo on the right there. And that is the end of my portion for this evening. I will leave you with this image of Johnny Canuck conducting a chorus of the Maple Leaf Forever with a wide range of characters. I thought it was a nice symbol of cooperation and peace between nations, something that we can hope to see some more of in the future. So thank you for listening, and I will hand things back to Dana for now.
Well, thank you, Fiona, and it is makes me feel hopeful to see that final image of cooperation, especially between Johnny Canuck and Uncle Sam. I'm going to sprinkle in some little bit fun facts about Canada in between each presenters. So my fun fact number 1 is that Canada has the longest coastline in the world and stretches over 6 different time zones. So our next presenter is Professor Greg Staub. Greg teaches history at University College out of the north out of Thompson, Manitoba. He grew up in Arkona and has published studies on Arkona, Port Franks, and Whittier. Greg, thanks for joining us, and please go ahead with your presentation.
So I don't have an artifact per se to share, but my talk is going to focus on local politics, or a national event and local politics. And so I don't have access to this, but rather this is a famous poster from the 1891 Dominion or federal election of 1891. And it's certainly very meant to be patriotic. It was, of course, a Conservative Party poster celebrating Sir John A. Macdonald. And of course, it refers to the old flag, the unofficial flag of Canada at the time, the red ensign, the old policy, which was the national policy, and of course the old leader. As controversial as he is, and certainly deservedly so, I'm going to focus in on the realities of how this national election played out at a local level. I don't think we tend to think of elections as unifying forces. Obviously, by their very nature, they are divisive and partisan in some ways, but they are a moment that bring the country together. And I think there's something very interesting and important about coming together on a particular day, regardless of your political beliefs and with whom you vote. And one of my favorite pieces of Canadian literature is Stephen Leacock's book from 1912, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town. And when I was rereading that book, he has a chapter on the sort of a satirical look at the 1911 federal election. And this brought to mind, to me, the 1891 election as it played out in Arkona. So in February of 1891, it was indicated that as far as Arkona was concerned, quote, politics is the topic of the day. And readers of the Watford Guide-Advocate were asked, quote, who will be the candidates in the coming election? The election was a hotly contested one, with the Liberals promising to pursue unrestricted reciprocity or free trade with the United States, while the Conservative Party wrapped themselves in the Union Jack, promised to maintain their protectionist measures, collectively known as the national policy. In Arkona, the building excitement about the election did not detract from the news that Reeve Ernest Everett had recently been elected as a trustee of the Ontario College of Pharmacies, nor that Maud Cliff had returned to Arkona after a lengthy visit away. Even election news paled somewhat when it was announced that Mrs. N. George, her sister, had delivered triplet boys in far-off Traverse City, Michigan. On February 9th, the politically active members of the community held meetings in order to elect delegates who would represent the area at political conventions to be held in the village of Watford. The following week, it was noted that, quote, the Grits and Tories are hard at work. Grits was the nickname for the Liberals, and Tories, of course, referred to the Conservative Party. While residents may have been pleased to learn that, quote, the Queen's Hotel has been repainted throughout and now looks as slick as a new dollar, local Tory partisans were probably more excited by the fact that MacDonald himself was campaigning in southern Ontario, and a group of Tory diehards made the trip to Arkona via horse-drawn cutter to see the old leader speak. Now, one man apparently was convinced that he could walk from Arkona to Strathroy faster, and ultimately the cutter overtook him at Adelaide Village and apparently gave him a lift. For those who did not or could not hear the old leader in person, many conservatives affectionately call many conservatives undoubtedly attended the political rally at Learns Hall for Conservative candidate George Moncrief, whose supporters frequently used the slogan, quote, hurrah for MacDonald and Moncrief. Local Tory organizers did their best to ensure the visit went off without a hitch, but apparently they fell victim to some local malcontents. As the correspondent for the Watford Guide-Advocate reported, quote, the Arkona Brass Band was engaged to play at Mr. Moncrief's political meeting here on the evening of the 26th. On the morning of that day, they found that someone had stolen the mouthpieces for the instruments. To say that they were mad is putting it rather mild. They, of course, put the blame on the Grits, but it is likely that it was done as a practical joke. Not to be outdone, they sent to Thetford for mouthpieces and were able to fulfill their agreement. The missing mouthpieces, curiously, turned up the next morning. In the meantime, other matters continued as usual. The Presbyterian Church held their own tea meeting at Learns Hall, taking in $33.90 at the door. The local correspondent, who had ill-concealed Tory sympathies, made no specific mention of Liberal candidate Richard Stutt coming to Arkona, but given that he was a Bezanquet Township farmer, he must have come through at some point. During the final week of the frenetic campaigning, quote, Arkona was a lively grist of political meetings, and the political pot is boiling. For those who either shunned the bevy of election events or simply wished for other distractions, they may have attended the, quote, regular old-fashioned dance at T. Bartlett's, at which everyone had a good time. Election Day, March 5th, 1891, saw the electors cast their ballots. And of course, we have to remember that only men cast ballots in the 19th century. And the population awaited anxiously the results to be announced. News passed to the various ridings across the country via telegraph to the railway depots and newspaper offices, and people gathered to catch the latest news. There was a telegraph office as well as one telephone in Arkona connecting it to the broader world. In Arkona, it was said, quote, "The election here on Thursday last passed off very quietly during the day. But at night, the village was full of people anxious to hear the result. The reformers had Learns Hall, and the conservatives were packed in at Pieces Hall. When the news arrived that Moncrieff was in with such a large majority, the enthusiasm knew new bounds in the Tory ranks." While the Tories were celebrating the local win, word apparently reached the initially demoralized Liberal Assembly that in the end Sir John A. Macdonald's government had collapsed. As the possibly Tory-minded Arkona correspondent for the Watford Guide explained, quote, "The Grits labored under the impression that the old man, Macdonald, was defeated, and paraded the streets, singing and cheering, rang the town bell, and made things hum generally. When they found their mistake next morning, their spirits dropped 60 degrees. As both parties received the same returns, someone must have been off in their calculations." Arkona Grits could be forgiven for their confusion. There had been confusion reported in many local newspapers about the ultimate result. In a post-mortem analysis of the election, many Arkona Liberals attempted to understand the outcome. While Richard Stutt had received a majority of 12 votes in Arkona, a drop from 7 votes in February of 1887, it was quickly realized that some 10 well-known Liberal supporters who were absentee landowners and therefore had the right to vote in Arkona had not cast their votes in the village. The euphoria of Arkona's conservatives was quickly channeled into preparations for a major banquet of the victorious Moncrieff, which was held at Learns Hall, which had been the Liberal headquarters during the election. As the Watford Guide Advocate reported, quote, "One of the most successful affairs of the kind ever held in Arkona was the banquet tendered to Mr. George Moncrieff, MP, at Learns Hall on Friday evening by the Liberal Conservatives of Canada, Arkona and vicinity." The Conservatives sometimes went by the moniker of Liberal Conservative. Over 500 guests were present, and ample justice was done to the generous supply of delicacies provided for the occasion. The platform was filled by local politicians, along with 2 women, Mrs. E. McGillicuddy and Mrs. Moncrieff, the sole female participants on the stage. The celebration, however, had begun when 20 little girls sang a song of welcome. Moncrieff then addressed the assembly, and afterward his wife was presented with a bouquet. More than 12 others were made brief addresses appropriate to the occasion. It was then explained that the speechifying was interspersed with suitable music furnished by Miss Trimble, Champion Brothers, and another chorus of little girls who sang an original selection entitled "Marching On to Ottawa," after cheers for Sir John, the Queen, and Mr. Moncrieff. One of the most enthusiastic and enjoyable banquets ever held in Arkona was brought to a close. Now, certainly, in terms of electioneering, it's not unique to Canada. Many nations have elections, but it's said, of course, that all politics is local. And I think that's a key thing we need to keep in mind and recognize that an examination of local realities for larger events like national elections can be very instructive and give us a great insights into the politics, the social realities, and so on that exist in our own communities throughout time.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. It's always interesting how little some things have changed and what we can learn. Thank you. My second fun Canadian fact is that over 70% of the global supply of maple syrup comes from Canada. Most of the supply comes from Quebec, but other producers are Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. So I'm going to share my presentation now. A moment to get my screen up. Okay. I will be pulling from the Lambton Heritage Museum's collection and showcasing some of the artifacts that feature our national symbols. For those who haven't had a chance to visit, Lambton Heritage Museum is located south of Grand Bend, across from Pinery Provincial Park on Highway 21. We collect and interpret the history of the entire county of Lambton, preserving and presenting local stories and local history. The first thing I did when we settled on this theme for Heritage Hour was search the museum collections database for beaver. I actually also searched the collection for duct tape as another very Canadian item, but I didn't find anything when I searched for duct tape. As an aside, did you know that you can search the collections of Lambton Heritage Museum, the Oil Museum of Canada, and the Lambton County Archives all in one place? If you visit lambtoncountymuseums.pastperfectonline.com, you can access these three great collections with a single search. You'll find objects, photographs, and documents, all related to our local history. All three institutions are actively adding more items to our online catalogs, and we currently have over 16,000 items that you can explore. One of the items that's in our online catalog, when you search for beaver, is this amazing wooden figurehead. Our catalog describes him as a spirited folk carving, and I always loved that language. He is made up of 4 sections that are fastened together with pegs. Carved out of softwood, the beaver has a dark brown finish and retains golden highlights. The best part of this beaver is the maple leaf that's clutched in his mouth. It's painted green and sticks out against the beaver's fur and his teeth. It's a charming detail added by the original artist that elevates the beaver from a single national symbol into a combination of 2 powerful elements of our Canadian identity. We don't know who the carver was, although we do know the original purpose and use of this interesting piece. So what is the beaver's story? He used to grace the deck of a ship called the SS Ontario as a wooden emblem perched on top of the pilot house. The Ontario was built in Chatham and launched in 1873. It was the second ship built by the J&H Beatty Company that operated Sarnia's Beatty Line, one of the pioneer navigating firms of the Upper Great Lakes. The J&H Beatty Line was established in Sarnia in about 1870. In addition to the SS Ontario, they quickly acquired 5 additional ships. Here's a close-up of the image from the previous slide. You can see the beaver perched on the pilot house, standing guard over the SS Ontario with his big teeth pointed towards the bow. The SS Ontario was a favorite of Sarnians and new immigrants to the area, who used to travel across Lake Huron and Lake Superior from the rail terminal at Sarnia to Thunder Bay. Many boarded the railway in Thunder Bay and continued west to the Canadian prairies. The Ontario traveled this route until 1897, when heavy repair and maintenance bills led to her sale. The Beatty Line was reorganized as the Northwest Transportation Company, and after 32 years of operating out of Sarnia, the company was purchased by Collingwood's Northern Navigation Company in 1902. This arrangement allowed the Beatty boats to continue running their old routes, and it brought new ships and resources into the costly business of running a Great Lakes shipping company. Some of the other items in our museum collection related to beavers include hats made from beaver fur. This segues nicely into why the beaver is an iconic symbol of Canada. As Fiona mentioned earlier, the beaver was a critical component of the fur trade in the 1600s to the mid-1800s. Beavers were so coveted because their fur was perfect to make the felt hats that were all the rage in Europe. Beaver fur makes excellent felt because each hair has a series of barbs on it. The sketch on this slide shows how the barbs interlock with each other. Because of this special quality, beaver fur is perfectly suited for making felt. It keeps its shape under rough handling and after repeatedly getting wet. Now I'm going to explore the maple leaf, which did not become a symbol of national identity until the 1800s. Since time immemorial, the maple tree has been prized by Canada's Indigenous peoples for the sappy, sweet treasure trapped inside. Throughout the 1800s, the maple leaf was incorporated into crests and designs across Canada. When our Canadian flag was adopted on February 15, 1965, it had a bold red maple leaf as its centerpiece. A stylized maple leaf became the symbol for Canada's centennial celebrations in 1967, as seen on this flag from our museum collection. One of the most beautiful examples of the maple leaf I found in our museum is this piece of trench art. Trench art was created by soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians from the debris of war like discarded bullets and shell casings. This item was made from an artillery shell after the Battle of the Somme, a pivotal event during the First World War that lasted from July until November 1916. More than 3 million men fought in the Battle of the Somme, and more than 1 million were killed or wounded. Over 24,000 of those casualties were Canadian. The soldier who made this trench art engraved the words Somme Front 1916 on the artillery shell. The shell is made from a 4.5-inch howitzer, a short cannon that fired projectiles. The trench art may have been used as an ashtray or an inkwell. It has two finely carved maple leaf details that stand proudly on either side of the battle's name. This is a second piece of trench art that came to the museum from the same donor. You can see the cap badge on the front of the hat is shaped like a maple leaf. Trench art offers us not only insight into the types of materials that appeared during wartime, but also the emotions and the mindset of the artist about the conflict. Many soldiers looked at their trench art as a memento of their service, and they brought pieces back to Canada after they served overseas. Another item from the First World War are these pins from Lambton's 149th Battalion. The 149th was formed after enlistment efforts in 1915 and 1916. The battalion marched in communities across Lambton County recruiting volunteers for the war effort. Both of these pins belong to George Bullock of Uttoxeter. The one on the left is a cap pin. Another maple leaf example is the ceremonial chain for the warden of the County of Lambton. Each medallion is engraved with a year and the corresponding name of the warden elected that year. The medallions are joined by a series of delicate maple leaves. The county crest is included, featuring our logo Le jour viendra, or the day will come. Handcrafted violin features a dog lying on a maple leaf. It was made by Dennis O'Meara, who was born in 1858 and lived on a farm beside the Faithorn estate in Brights Grove. That's the current site of the Brights Grove Library. He likely couldn't afford to purchase a violin, and he carved this one out of soft maple. Despite the fact he had limited experience, O'Meara added lovely artistic touches to the work, like the dog and the maple leaf. He also left a remarkable inscription inside the violin, which reads, "When I was carrying up this piece of timber, the wild pigeons were passing over in billions. There's more maple grows than is ever taken out of the bush. This fiddle was dug out, tree soft maple, with a chisel and knife, neck, sounder, and back, all in one." I want to touch briefly on the wild pigeons passing over in billions that O'Meara referenced in his inscription. In the 1800s, passenger pigeons lived in huge flocks that darkened the skies and drowned out conversation as they passed. Once the most abundant bird in North America, their numbers dropped dramatically by the end of the 1800s due to overhunting and deforestation. They are now extinct. The preserved passenger pigeon on this slide is part of the museum collection. In the sketch on this slide by J.C. MacArthur from 1876, men are depicted hunting passenger pigeons in Lambton County when they were still abundant. Local resident Sam Hitchcock reflected in his 1850 autobiography, "I can remember when father used to go after the wild pigeons. In the evening, just as the sun was down, the pigeons would come over our house in the thousands." My final example here comes from our pressed glass collection. We have many different types of pressed glass, featuring a maple leaf pattern with Concordia-style maple leaves. The style of the leaf in the two pieces on the left indicate they were likely produced by a Montreal glass house, although the exact manufacturer is unknown. Thank you for listening to my presentation and exploring some of the items in Lambton Heritage Museum's collection that reflect our national symbols. Stop sharing. Great. And now we are going to hear from Kaylin Shepley, who's the curator at Sombre Museum. She's been in that position since 2017. Her educational background is in the languages and history, and she's currently completing a program in museum studies.
All right, then. So I'm for the Made in Canada Canadian Symbols and Artifacts presentation. There were so many items in our collection. We also have some beaver felt hats and many maple leaf items, rare beaver mason jars. But since the beaver seemed to be a very popular topic, I decided to go with a unique artifact from the Sombre Museum collection. It relates to the river and is nationally known item. So we have the Miss Super Test 3. It was a power boat that became a bit of a hero in the Canadian sports world, equivalent to it won a race that was equivalent to winning the Stanley Cup, and it won it 3 years in a row. So it's quite fantastic, and we will explore its story. There we go. So can you see the next slide now?
Yeah, looks great.
Excellent. Sorry about that. Okay, so the Harmsworth Trophy was a popular name for the historically important British International Trophy for motorboats. It was first contested in 1903, and great excitement was had. Officially, it is a contest between nations rather than individuals or boat drivers. Originally, the boats were designed to be designed and built entirely by residents of the country they represented, using materials built wholly within that country. This led to some hard feelings, griping, and light unofficial accusations of cheating from the American competitors of Miss Super Test 3, the eventual Canadian champion, who complained that Canadian use of her British-made Rolls-Royce jet engines was unfair. The Canadian team was, however, in the clear as a member of the former British Empire and the Commonwealth, whose official head of state happened to be Queen Elizabeth II, also Queen of England, meaning that we were essentially part of England and could get away with using the Rolls-Royce engines. In 1933, the prestigious race was held in the St. Clair River between Marine City and Algonac, so right in front of Sombra and Port Lambton. The main combatants were Challenger Miss Britain 3, driven by Hubert Scott Payne, and champion Gar Wood in Miss America X. Communities on both sides of the Harmsworth racecourse were hoping to cash in on the event, and approximately 100,000 spectators locally and from around the world took part. If you've never been to Sombra or Port Lambton, we're very small villages. Port Lambton was actually a vacation resort at the time, so very sparsely populated, and having 100,000 people crammed into our small towns is about I would guess 200 times the current population of the town of Sombra. So it's quite a crowd. In Sombra and Port Lambton, every inch of waterfront was a prime viewing location. People were even selling space on top of their cars so that people could have a raised view off the ground. And those in need who were very desperate were paying a prime price for these somewhat awkward and dangerous seats. In Sombra, near the present-day ferry dock, bleachers and concession stands were set up at McRitchie's Pavilion. Grandstands were also erected at Minnie's near Smithline. An unforeseen problem was that the viewing was even better from the water on the Canadian side of the St. Clair River, so passenger boats and private boats all vied for the best spots possible at the expense to those on shore. So even though people were paying $1 or more in 1933, which during the Depression was quite a bit of money, they still possibly weren't getting a great view. So here on the left, we have the Harmsworth Races official program for 1933. In the middle, we have the actual tickets from Sombra Museum's collection from Minnie's Stadium and McRitchie's Pavilion. And on the right, you can see the grandstand in Sombra, which would have been McRitchie's Pavilion for the Harmsworth Races. The American Garwood once again won the trophy that year for the powerboat race. The grandstands are a bit hard to see, but on the left there, beside the building, that is where the wooden grandstands were erected. So now on to the Miss Super Test. Miss Super Test was the first non-American winner in 39 years of the Harmsworth Trophy. So it was a very big deal that we had finally beat the Americans. In fact, to the newspaper, the owner, Jim Thompson, said, "Well, we beat the Americans." That was his big quote for the race. So in the photos here, we have Miss Super Test, Bob Hayward, the driver, on Miss Super Test 3 on the left, and the Miss Super Test 3 receiving the Harmsworth Trophy. So in the country's centennial year, 1967, there was a slim volume published by two writers, Trent Frayne and Peter Gzowski, spinning the greatest sports story of Canada's first century. You would think it would have something to do with hockey, but no, the cover image was actually the Miss Super Test 3 powerboat with a tail of spray boiling behind it. It was on display at the Toronto International Boat Show, and for many years, starting in 1967, was on display at the Ontario Science Centre. It went off display and was bought in 2017 by a man from the son of the original owner, and that inspired him actually to create the Canadian Race Boat Hall of Fame, which I'll talk about a little later. So the most impressive thing about the Miss Super Test 3 was that it only raced 4 times in its entire career, between 1959 and 1961, before being pulled from the water for good, after a tragic crash which killed its driver. Back in the days where the race was run, the headlines were splashed across newspaper sports sections and resonated similarly to the golden goal by Sidney Crosby at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. So Miss Super Test 3 had its day. The owner, Jim Thompson, his father, Gordon, founded the petroleum company, Super Test, for which the boat got its name. He entered the world of unlimited hydroplane racing in 1950, taking over from another Canadian group which had attempted unsuccessfully to win the Harmsworth Cup, which was emblematic of the supremacy of the sport. So the boat was rechristened from Miss Canada 4 to Miss Super Test. Miss Super Test 2 followed an original design which briefly held the world speed record of more than 184 miles an hour, and then Miss Super Test 3, the pinnacle, powered by the same Rolls-Royce Griffin engine that had been used in the last versions of the Spitfire fighter aircraft. Thompson did some of the testing, but he wasn't a speed demon by nature, and due to the fact that he had a young family, he chose not to race. He didn't think that the risk would be fair to his wife and young children. Instead, the driving duties eventually fell to a round-faced chicken farmer from Embro, Ontario, named Bob Hayward, who was already working on the boat as part of the mechanical crew before Thompson found out about his reputation as a drag racer. And when he took the wheel, it became the perfect pairing of man and machine. They first raced in the Detroit Memorial in 1959, a practice race, before challenging for the Harmsworth, which had been in the U.S. hands for 39 years, as I previously said. Hayworth won it with Miss Super Test 3 on the Detroit River in 1959, and then he repeated the feat in Picton, Ontario in 1960 and 1961, the first boat ever to win 3 times in a row. A little over 2 weeks after that third victory, Hayward was back racing again, this time in Miss Super Test 2. Miss Super Test 3 was reserved only for the biggest races. They were on the Detroit River, and Jim Thompson was watching from the Waterside Hotel on the U.S. side. And to quote him, he said, Bob Hayward, had a poor start. He was back, and then he just stepped on it. There were 2 boats in front of him. He passed them just before the first turn, going very fast. About halfway around the turn, he rolled like that, right around and came up again. That's all it took. I knew it was bad right away. There was very little damage to the boat. That was the crazy part of it. But that's all it took. He would have been traveling well over 100 miles an hour. Hayward was dead, and no Miss Supertest would ever race again. When Thompson made that official 6 months after Hayward died, most believed he had simply lost heart following the accident, but he says in an interview that it wasn't only that. He said, "I'm sure it was interpreted that way, but I surely wouldn't have been at it much longer even if Bob hadn't been killed. We had other lives to live. This was 10 or 11 years, very intensive, a very tremendous amount of work. It wasn't easy taking the boat out of the water, but I think it was the right thing to do." There was no Canadian willing to carry on the tradition, though Thompson was more than willing to pass on his accumulated knowledge. The boats went into storage until then Premier John Roberts asked if they could put Miss Supertest 3 on permanent display at the newly opened Science Center. A few years back, in the early 2000s, the Science Center was redesigned and the boat again disappeared from public view. It came out only for occasional special appearances until it was sold off. And then we have another quote from Thompson. He was talking about the unveiling of a postage stamp to celebrate the triumphs of Canadian sports moments long past. And not just because the Miss Supertest was once the fastest boat in the world, or because of who built it or who designed it, but what it came to represent for Canada. Thompson was quoted as saying, "Let's face it, we Canadians are no slouches." This photograph here is a close-up from an article in the Canada's Sporting Hall of Fame, Yachting Magazine, 1984. So it's Bob Hayward in the cockpit of Miss Supertest 3. This was part of a donation to Sombre Museum. And we have the Miss Supertest 3 stamp. So the stamp was released on August 7th of 2011 to commemorate the third straight victory of Miss Supertest 3. It was a 59-cent stamp purchased for the Sombre Museum collection after we acquired a model of the Miss Supertest 3 boat. And it commemorated the 50th anniversary of the event. So here is the Miss Supertest 3 in miniature. It came with its own case that was designed by Chuck Roberts of Port Lambton. It lists the length, width, weight, and other design features on the case, and then says designed and built by C. Roberts. And now here is the model of the Miss Supertest. So it's made of mahogany. And you notice that it does not have a motor in the boat. It was actually a proprietary design that he had worked on with Jim Thompson and others, and he did not want the design to be copied at all. They was very secretive in the world of model motorboat racing. Your motor basically makes your boat, and it can be very competitive. So he removed the engine before donating the model. And here's a closer look at it from a different angle. It's actually quite a gorgeous little model. And then here we have Chuck Roberts. He's creating a precise scale model of the boat. At left, he's starting the center section and putting struts in place. At center, he's using clothespins to hold the glue, and at right, he's fitting the engine.
Sorry,
So
Kaylin, we can't see that slide. We're still on the slide of the model.
Oh, sorry. There we go. Can you see that now? There seems to be a leg in
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Sorry about that. So I'm going to read a little story that was written by Chuck about his experience with the Miss Supertest. So Chuck Roberts had a 25-year love affair. It was going great until his sweetheart hit a log at about 104 kilometers an hour out on Sharon Creek back in June. His sweetheart was a painstakingly handcrafted precise scale model of Miss Supertest 3, and the Sharon Creek log just about tore one of her sponsons off. The original Miss Supertest 3, London designed and built, was the stuff of legends, and in model boat building and racing circles in Canada and the United States, Roberts has become something of a legend too. His creation is a 117-centimeter long, or 46 inches, faithful replica of Miss Supertest 3, a replica Roberts believes could be as dominating in the model racing field as the big boat was on the Detroit River and the Bay of Quinte. Non-drinking and non-smoking, Roberts is a busy man. He's a transport driver with M. Loeb in London by trade and has a leased-out farm near Port Lambton. He once taught neophyte truck drivers, and he used to have his own country and western band and restores and refinishes antique furniture. On the day of the interview, on a sweltering July, he was just back from work and taking a break from filling the backyard swimming pool in. He's still a little broken up over the breaking up of his love affair. "We done her in. It took everything out of me," he said sadly of the Sharon Creek crash. He spent 27 months working on the model in his basement workshop, and he's quick to credit others for an incredible amount of priceless help. Topping the list is Jim Thompson, designer of the original Miss Supertest 3, who provided Roberts with the prized blueprints and hours of advice and help, and is getting the model racer set up properly. In scale model terms, Roberts explains the 104 km/h that his radio-controlled model was doing when it hit the log would translate into something like 670 km/h for a full-sized hydroplane. The real Miss Supertest 3 set a course record of 201.95 km/h in the 9-lap 72-kilometer Harmsworth in 1961, meaning that Hayward was hitting top speeds of 320 km/h on the straightaways. "We just had her in one race on May 6th at Lansing, Michigan," Roberts says. "The American guys were amazed at her power and acceleration. But I wasn't satisfied. I'd gone through propeller after propeller, trying to find just exactly the right one. I picked up a new prop in Lansing, and in mid-June we took her out to Sharon Creek to try it out. After just one pass, I said, 'This is it. This is the one.' And then she hit the log." This is the fourth model of Miss Supertest that Roberts has built. The first one is mounted in a case in his living room. It took him 4 years, and he didn't use blueprints, just photographs. And one of the other 3 took him 8 years, and he figures it was when Thompson heard he'd spent more than 1,100 hours on it that he decided to share the secrets of his blueprints. It took him hundreds of hours of sawing and planing Honduras mahogany, Finland birch, and Sitka spruce down to the precise scale thickness he demands. He spent hundreds of hours hacksawing, filing, and hand polishing metal fittings, such as rudders and propeller struts, and spent hundreds of hours fine-tuning the Italian-made nitro-fueled model engines, boosting their horsepower from between 2.5 and 3 horsepower at 18,000 RPM to about 5 horsepower at 23,000 RPM. He insists on absolute accuracy in reproducing Miss Supertest hauls, but he's not too proud to use clothespins, rubber bands, and even jars of his wife Bessie's preserves as weights to hold the parts together while the glue dries. He said that he could spend hours and hours talking about boats. He also credits his wife, saying she contributed more than just the jars of pickles. She made the tiny life-size jacket for the exact scale driver who sits in the model's cockpit. So here is the only photo we have of that. And Roberts challenges you to guess, who is this holding the doll? "It's the Fawns." "All right," he says. And so that. Now here is Miss Supertest 3, the real boat, after the Science Center closed. As I said, it went into storage, and then it was finally purchased in 2017 from Gordon Thompson by James Smith. And according to the website of the Canadian Raceboat Hall of Fame, this led to his desire to start the Hall of Fame to preserve the history of the drivers, designers, and builders who brought international boat racing fame to Canada. The Raceboat Hall of Fame opened in Bracebridge, Ontario within the last 1 to 2 years, and Miss Supertest is the crown jewel of its collection. And so that is it for me. I hope that you enjoyed my presentation. And I will turn it back over to Dana.
Great. Thank you very much, Kaylin. I liked Jim Thompson's quote, well, we beat the Americans.
Yes,
Such a very Canadian thing to say.
it is.
So I've got another Canadian fun fact. Canada has the largest moose population in the world. If they can survive predators and hunters, moose can live up to 20 years. So our final presentation tonight is from David McLean, representing the Forest Museum. David taught high school history for 31 years and is currently a volunteer at the Forest Museum and the Plimpton, Wyoming Museum. He holds an honors BA in history from Huron College and a Bachelor of Education from Althouse Teachers College. Welcome, David.
Okay, thank you, Dana, and good evening. I'll just share my screen here. There we go.
It's good.
It's good. Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. I really enjoy all the topics presented here tonight. So just before I dive in here, there we go. This has nothing to do with my presentation tonight, but you may know that 80 years ago today was Victory in Europe Day. It was celebrated victory in Europe. So the war would continue, of course, until the Japanese surrendered later in the year. This photo that you see here shows the good folks of Forest and area celebrating the victory in Europe. So this is at King and Main Street, the main intersection uptown in Forest. And on the right is the proclamation from the mayor, Floyd Rumford, who was the mayor of the town, also a member of the Rumford family who ran the bakery in which our museum is located. And he mentions that at 8:15, the service to celebrate VE Day would be held at the town hall. So I don't know if you can see my mouse there. Now, the town hall is, you just barely see the tower up at the back, just off the center to the left. And then down below that is our building, which was the Rumford Bakery, of course, now the museum. So I just thought I'd share that for this date, 80 years ago today. The folks are celebrating that. So tonight I'm going to share with you several items in our collection I think everyone would agree represent a national symbol strongly connected with Canada's history and our sense of identity. And they are snowshoes. So there's my title page. And here are our snowshoes, our 3 pair of snowshoes. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the history of snowshoes here. First, full disclosure, I have my own pair of snowshoes, actually a couple of pair of snowshoes. One a more traditional looking one, which I think are the ones I've got on here, and one a more modern pair. So I enjoy using these for recreational purposes, and usually accompanied by our Labrador Retriever, Alice. As we prefer taking our walks in parks and countryside, it's often necessary. Like this past winter, it had some deep snow, often necessary for me to use the snowshoes to keep up with her. Alice loves the snow, but looking at this picture, I think you'd agree, I think I need to get her own pair or 2 pairs of snowshoes. So anyways, so no one knows for certain who made the first snowshoes. It seems that wherever ancient people had to trek through snow, they developed appropriate footwear to help them get around. However, it is generally agreed that it was the indigenous people of North America who can lay claim to making, many thousands of years ago, the first snowshoe with the webbed design with which we are familiar. Although modern snowshoes, like you see on the right here, are made from different materials, the basic design has largely been maintained. So snowshoes were vital to Canada's First Nations forest survival. They were crucial for hunting, trapping, and traveling during the harsh winter months. And when European explorers, fur trappers, and settlers arrived on the scene, they soon realized the necessity of snowshoes for travel in Canada in the winter and adopted them for their own use. Now, we've heard much reference to the beaver here tonight already, of course, the Canadian symbol. So the beaver is widely accepted, a widely accepted symbol of Canada due to the fur trade's significant role in shaping our history. But if not for the sharing by Indigenous people of their knowledge of how to navigate the interior of Canada, and also sharing with the Europeans the means to do so, that is, with technology like the canoe, the kayak, and snowshoes, they would have been greatly hampered in their quest to colonize this land with its often challenging geography and climate. And this, I didn't know about this. Despite my knowledge of Canadian history, I guess, there's always gaps, and this was a gap for me. But in 1758, during the 7 Years' War, which I taught about, I never taught about this battle for some reason, the potential military value of snowshoes was made evident during a battle in what is now upstate New York that pitted British forces against French soldiers and their Indigenous allies. The engagement, fought in terrain covered in 4 feet of snow, was actually dubbed the Battle on Snowshoes. Today, armed forces operating in snowy climes make extensive use of snowshoes. And of course, recreational snowshoeing is quite popular in Canada. For all these reasons, snowshoes deserve to be recognized as a truly Canadian symbol. So crafting traditional snowshoes was typically a multi-day endeavor, which involved both men and women in their production. Prior to assembly, Indigenous peoples carefully selected suitable wood, often the strong and flexible ash or birch, for the frames. To make the wood pliable for shaping, it was steamed or soaked. The snowshoes were then meticulously laced using rawhide strips known as babiche, cut from the hides of deer, caribou, or moose. Lighter babiche was used for the toe and tail sections, while a heavier weave in the central area provided better support. Moccasins were then secured to the snowshoes with leather or rawhide straps. Although some artisans still handcraft snowshoes, the practice is now uncommon. Today, most snowshoes are mass-produced with aluminum frames and steel cleats. Traditional wooden and hide snowshoes, however, are recognized now as art forms, proudly displayed in cultural centers and museums throughout North America. Canada's Indigenous peoples make quite a variety of snowshoes, as seen in this image, and I'll just talk about the first couple here. But the most common traditional styles are the Huron, the Bear Paw, the Ojibwe, and the Alaskan. And each was suited to the particular landscape and snow conditions where it was used. For example, the Huron style on the left, which is probably the most commonly recognized, has a teardrop, or some describe as a beaver tail or even a racket shape to it. These snowshoes are suitable for various snow conditions and became common in the St. Lawrence region of Canada in the United States. The bear paw snowshoe, the second one here, and you see it, the traditional bear paw as well, they're over to the right, is the second most well-known snowshoe design. It originated among the Indigenous peoples of Eastern Quebec and Labrador, particularly the Innu, and is suited to long-distance hikes in dense forests. Its broad shape provides efficient and silent movement and better flotation in deep snow. So I believe our snowshoes, coming back to an image in the here, are of the Huron style. Somebody who knows more about snowshoes than I do can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I think that's what they most closely resemble. So, and you're probably wondering, are these actually Indigenous made snowshoes? Now, unfortunately, regarding the one on the left in the middle, I can't verify that they are, but I suspect they may have been. According to our catalog, these two snowshoes, the one on the left and the one in the middle, hung on the wall of a cottage as far back as 1910. And the catalog says they date to the early 1800s. That would make them about 200 years old. As you would expect, both are quite fragile and have to be handled with much care. Regarding the newer one on the right, I can confirm that it was indeed made by an Indigenous craftsperson. According to a stamp on it, which I'll give you a close-up of here, it was made by the Gros Louis Snowshoe Company of Huron Village in Quebec, which is now Huron Village is now called Wendake. Wendake is home to descendants of Huron peoples who migrated to Quebec from Ontario to flee attack by the Iroquois and the Haudenosaunee. So you can see over the left there, the Georgian Bay area, if you've been up to Midland, Michigan, St. Marie on the Huron, that area there. So quite large Huron settlements there, driven off, and they fled to Quebec City. The Huron were allies of the French. And so you can see Wendake just to the north of Quebec City there. So Max Gros Louis, born 1931, passed away in 2020, was a prominent member of the community and served as the Grand Chief of the Huron-Wendat Nation. After many years as a hunter, trapper, and guide, Gros Louis opened up a small shop in 1959 in Wendake where he sold snowshoes, moccasins, and other First Nation crafts. So this snowshoe, the one on the right, is now older than 66 years, which I thought to myself, that no longer seems like it's that old, 66 years. Okay, so thank you for allowing me to share with you a little bit about our snowshoes and how they represent a culturally and historically significant part of our identity as Canadians. And we hope to see you all at the Forest Museum this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We have a pair of snowshoes in our museum collection, and I now know that they are the Huron style, which I didn't know before. So thank you for sharing. I have one final fun Canadian fact. And that is some of the inventions that we can claim in Canada are the goalie mask, insulin, the foghorn, the snowblower, egg cartons, Wonder Bra, paint roller, and peanut butter. So, and I did get a comment in the Q&A reflecting back on Kaylin's presentation that I wanted to share. Person said, I believe the Thompson family maintained a summer cottage in Corunna for many years. I had the privilege of meeting Jim Thompson many times when I had a summer job at Sunningdale Golf and Country Club, which was founded by his father. He was a very modest and wonderful gentleman. So thank you for sharing. If anyone else has any questions for the presenters, you can put those in the Q&A. I'm just going to take a few moments to share some updates from our regional museums, and then we can address any questions. So update from Forest Museum. Their 2025 annual general meeting is next Thursday, May 15th at 7 p.m. Everyone is welcome to attend. The museum's opening date is May 20th. They'll be open from 10 to 2, Tuesday to Saturday until October. They would love to welcome you at 8 Main Street North in beautiful downtown Forest. And plans are underway for an event in June at the Old Carnegie Library. It will celebrate all things blueberry. So stay tuned to their Facebook page and website for details. Moore Museum is having a big year. They're celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. You can join them on June 7th from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. for a free event with costume demonstrators, activities in each building, and tea and scones in the Riley Cottage. There will be a short ceremony at 1 o'clock to commemorate the anniversary, including a plaque unveiling, and then activities until 5. On July 6th, it's Moore Museum's Model Train Day from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. They will have guest model railroaders, extra displays and demonstrators, the Triple C wood carvers, and expert volunteers to answer all of your questions. Admission is $6 for adults and $3 for children. Sombra Museum's Speaker Series continues on May 13th at 3 p.m. with Christina Sidorko from the Oil Museum of Canada. She's speaking on understanding the 1970s oil crisis and its local impacts. Tickets are $10 at the door. Sombra Museum's annual Blueberry Social is coming up July 5th from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Come enjoy fresh and delicious blueberry treats, beverages, live entertainment, and the dedication of the Smith Log Cabin Pavilion with interactive pioneer demonstrations. They hope to see you there. July 5th is also the grand opening of their featured exhibit based on everyone's favorite building toy, Lego. Follow Sombra Museum's social channels for more information and sneak peeks as the grand opening approaches. Here at Lambton Heritage Museum, a new feature exhibit opens May 14th. Taste of Science is on loan from the Canadian Agricultural and Food Museum and explores the science behind why food spoils. A special PA Day event on June 6th will include demonstrations and activities like sorting food packaging by how it preserves freshness, observing how decomposers break down food, and getting crafty with germ-themed creations. We also have the North Lambton Quilters Guild Quilt Show returning this summer. It kicks off with a special opening weekend, June 19th to 22nd. You can enjoy a vibrant display of stunning quilts and textiles and browse the Quilters Garage and vendor booths. After the opening weekend, a selection of quilts will remain on display at the museum until August 31st. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. So if there aren't any questions for our presenters, and we are running a bit over time, I would like to thank everyone who attended tonight and reflected on these interesting items from our museum collections and stories from our local history. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us tonight. I wish you a good night and hope to see you for the next Heritage Hour. Thank you.